The morning Claire Holt lost her biggest donor, the sky over Pittsburgh was the color of old iron. Not the dramatic charcoal of a coming storm, just gray. Flat and indifferent, impermanent, the way the sky gets in February when winter has stopped being a season and become a condition. She sat in her car in the parking lot of the Allegheny Community Trust building for 4 minutes after the meeting ended, not thinking, just breathing, watching the exhaust from the building's heating vents curl upward and disappear into that gray nothing above. Inside, a man named Gerald Pratt, soft hands, good suit. The practiced sympathy of someone who delivered bad news professionally had told her that the trust was redirecting its community development funds. Unforeseen budgetary constraints, he said. He used the word unfortunately 3 times in 6 sentences. He did not meet her eyes when he said it. He met the table. Claire had nodded. She had thanked him for his time. She had walked out through the marble lobby with her spine straight and her face composed the way her mother had taught her, the way women in hard situations learn to walk, like the ground beneath them is solid even when they know it isn't. In the car, she allowed herself 4 minutes. Then she started the engine and drove. Her office was on the 2nd floor of a narrow building on Butler Street in Lawrenceville, sandwiched between a print shop and a tax preparation service. The sign on the door read, Meridian Community Coalition, in simple black letters. The window beside the sign had been repaired twice in the past 4 months. Each time it had been broken in the small hours of the morning. Each time the police report had noted no suspects. Each time Claire had called the glazier herself and paid from the operating budget. She climbed the stairs and sat at her desk and opened her laptop and stared at the spreadsheet that told the story of an organization dying by 1,000 small cuts. 3 major donors had withdrawn in the past 6 weeks. The figures were clinical and precise and merciless. At the current rate of attrition, she had 11 weeks of operational funding remaining. 11 weeks to stop Warren Cross from breaking ground on the Meridian Riverfront project. 11 weeks to save a neighborhood that Cross Corporation had already written off as an acquisition. The Meridian Project. That was what they called it in the press releases. Clean language for a dirty plan. 240 acres of former industrial land along the Allegheny River. Prime real estate, river access, a developer's dream. Cross intended to build a distribution center and commercial warehouse complex on land that environmental advocates, Claire included, had spent years arguing was still contaminated from decades of steel production. The environmental impact studies Cross had submitted to the city were in Claire's professional judgment fiction. She had said so publicly. She had brought in independent scientists who agreed with her. She had presented their findings to 3 separate city council committees. Nothing had moved. Warren Cross was 72 years old. He had been building things in Pittsburgh for 40 years. His name was on a pediatric wing at UPMC. It was engraved above the entrance of an engineering school at Carnegie Mellon. His face appeared in the business section of the Post-Gazette with a frequency that suggested the paper considered him a civic institution rather than a subject of coverage. Men like that did not lose zoning disputes to community organizations with leaky windows and dying donor bases. Claire knew this. She had always known this. She fought anyway. It was a choice she made every morning when she unlocked the office door, the same way some people choose to believe in things that cost them something. She was still staring at the spreadsheet when her phone buzzed. A text from her volunteer coordinator. 2 more canvassers had dropped out of the weekend schedule. No explanation. She set the phone face down on the desk. Outside, the gray sky had darkened by a single shade. It was 11:15 in the morning. She needed coffee. She needed to think. She needed 11 weeks to turn into something more than 11 weeks. She got up, pulled her coat from the hook by the door, and walked out. The bridge over to the north side took her past the underpass at Anderson Street. She had driven this route 100 times and never stopped the way city people learn not to stop, not because they don't care, but because stopping doesn't change the math. But that morning she stopped, not by choice. A municipal truck was parked at an angle across the service lane, orange cones spread around it, and a man in a reflective city-issue vest was talking to someone Claire couldn't see. She rolled down her window. Cold air knifed in. Then she saw them, a man and a dog. The man was tall, lean beneath layers of worn clothing that had given up their original colors to time and weather. A brown leather jacket cracked at the elbows over a flannel shirt. His hair was dark with silver running through it at the temples, grown past the point of intention. His beard was rough and patchy. He looked to be in his early 40s, though the particular erosion of sleeping outside made age hard to read. He stood very still while the city worker spoke. Not slumped, not hostile, just still. The stillness of a man who has been told to move before and knows how to receive the instruction. Beside him was a German shepherd, gray and white large through the chest and shoulders, with amber eyes that tracked the city worker's movements with a calm, patient intelligence. The dog was not agitated, it simply watched. It sat pressed against the man's right leg as though it had been stationed there. The man nodded once. He pulled a shopping cart forward, a few bundled belongings, a sleeping bag, a cookpot, and began moving it toward the sidewalk. His left knee moved with a slight irregularity. Not a limp exactly, just the minor betrayal of an old injury that cold weather made honest. The city worker watched him go, then turned back to the truck. Claire was moving before she'd decided to move. She pulled into the lot of a nearby auto body shop, got out, walked back toward the bridge. The man had stopped at the corner looking across the river. The dog sat beside him. They were not moving with urgency. They were standing the way people stand when they're trying to figure out which direction has anything in it. She approached from the side, not from behind. She'd learned that. She pulled a 20 from her wallet. He saw her coming and watched her without expression. "Here," she said. She held the bill out. He looked at the money, then at her. His eyes were brown and deeply quiet. They were not the eyes she expected. She had expected vacancy or suspicion or the particular exhausted performance of gratitude that people who depend on strangers learn to produce. His eyes were none of those things. They were simply present, attentive, like someone who has stopped performing anything and arrived at a plain, unvarnished version of themselves. He took the 20. "Thank you," he said. His voice was low and rough, the texture of someone who didn't use it much. The dog regarded her steadily. It did not approach. It did not retreat. She walked back to her car. She did not think about them again for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, she arrived at the office to find a man sitting on the top step of the exterior staircase. The German shepherd was beside him, lying flat, head on its paws. The man was upright, his back against the railing, his eyes open. He had clearly been there for some time. She stopped on the sidewalk. He stood when he saw her. Not quickly, just steadily, with the deliberate economy of someone who conserves energy out of habit. The dog rose beside him. She recognized him. The jacket, the eyes. "Miss Holt," he said. She kept her distance. Her hand was near her phone. "You know my name?" "Your name's on the door," he said. He glanced at the sign. "I have something that belongs to you, or belonged to your family." She studied him for a moment. The stillness again. The dog was calm. An agitated man has an agitated dog. She had learned that somewhere, and it had never been wrong. "What is it?" she said. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a small wooden box. Dark wood smooth the size of a paperback novel. He held it out toward her without stepping forward, letting her close the distance on her terms. She climbed the stairs slowly. She took the box. It was lighter than she expected. She lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a piece of faded dark velvet, was a photograph. A man in his early 30s. Unruly brown hair. A face full of forward-leaning energy, this face of someone who was always about to say something. He was grinning. On his shoulders, holding his forehead with both small hands, was a little girl of 7 or 8 with dark pigtails, and her eyes squeezed shut in the particular joy of being up very high. Claire's breath stopped. She knew this photograph. She had known it her whole life. In the version she carried in her memory, it was framed on the mantelpiece of her childhood home in Lawrenceville. Her mother had kept it there until she died. But this was not a copy. This was not a scan. This was the original. The slight overexposure on the left side from a faulty camera flash. The small crease in the lower right corner where a 7-year-old had grabbed it one afternoon and bent it slightly before her mother gently took it back. "Where did you get this?" she said. It was not quite a question. "I can explain that," he said, "but not here." His name was Ethan Cole. He had been a sergeant in the Army, a recovery vehicle mechanic stationed at forward operating bases in places where the heat was a physical thing and the dust got into everything. He had been discharged 3 years ago. He had been on the streets of Pittsburgh for 14 months. He told her this not as biography, but as navigation, the minimum information required to establish who he was before he told her what he'd found. They sat in her office with the door locked and the blinds angled, and he spoke in the flat, efficient way of someone trained to deliver situation reports. His dog's name was Rex. They had been together since a fellow veteran heading into a care facility could no longer keep him. Rex had been trained for service work and retained all of it, though no paperwork certified him as anything. He was simply a dog who happened to be better at his job than most people. 3 days ago, Ethan had used his last $70 to bid on a storage unit at a delinquency auction on the south side. Coleridge Storage Unit 447. The auctioneer's name was Dale Hutchins, and he'd been relieved to have anyone bid at all on a unit that every professional buyer had already written off as a loss. The unit was exactly what it looked like from the door. A decade of accumulated nothing. Rotting cardboard mildewed clothing, the soft, wet remains of a life that had stopped being tended to. Every professional buyer had shown their light and run the calculation in under 10 seconds and walked away. Ethan had bought it because it was the only lot where the bidding hadn't climbed past $70, because it was what he could afford, and because sometimes you bet everything on the long shot when there's nothing left to bet. He had spent an hour working through the unit, finding nothing of value. He had been sitting on the concrete floor, he said, considering the particular quality of having made the worst possible decision with the last resources available when Rex had stopped listening to him. The dog had gone to the back wall, a single large sheet of plywood stained with moisture covering the rear of the unit. Rex had pressed his nose against the base of it and begun to scratch. Not erratically. Not the way a dog behaves when it's chasing a scent. Slowly, deliberately, with focus. Ethan had looked closer and seen the lines. Two perfectly vertical seams running floor to ceiling 3 feet apart in the surface of the plywood. Not water stains spreading outward from a source the way real moisture damage does. Straight lines, geometric. The kind of lines that only exist when something has been built to a measurement. He had used a rusted tire iron from the corner of the unit to pry the panel loose. Behind it was a cavity 2 feet deep running the full height of the wall. Dry, still, and holding 3 objects that had been placed, not thrown, set down with intention. The small wooden box with the photograph, a thick manila envelope sealed with red wax, unbroken, stamped with an insignia he hadn't recognized, and a flat black military-grade ammunition case, roughly 12 inches by 8, secured with 3 combination tumbler locks. He had brought them here because the photographs led him here. He had found other photographs inside the wooden box. The same man, different years. A child growing older in successive images. A woman who appeared in some of them dark-haired with the same stubborn set to her jaw that Ethan recognized in the woman sitting across from him now. He had searched the name on the back of one of the photos, Nathan Holt, written in faded pencil. He had found the organization on the second page of results. He placed the manila envelope on the desk between them. "I didn't open it," he said. "The wax was intact. It didn't belong to me to open." Claire looked at the envelope for a long moment. The red wax seal was brittle with age. An insignia pressed into it, the outline of something she couldn't identify at this distance. "Who sealed this?" she said. "There's a name on the back," he said. She turned the envelope over. Written in shaky, faded handwriting on the back flap were 3 words: "For whoever finds." And below that a name: Gerald Holt. The seal broke with a dry, quiet snap. She pulled the papers out slowly. The top page was a letter, handwritten on loose-leaf paper, the ink faded to a blue-gray, the handwriting unsteady, the script of someone whose hands had not been steady when they wrote it. She recognized her uncle's handwriting immediately. She had seen it on birthday cards throughout her childhood, on the inside cover of books he'd given her, on a letter he'd sent when her mother died, that she had kept in her dresser drawer for years. She began to read. The letter was dated November 2009. 15 years ago, Gerald Holt, Jerry as everyone had called him, had been the older brother. The cautious one, her mother always said. The practical one. Where Nathan had been fire, Jerry had been water. Steady, calm, and very, very careful. The letter began with an apology. It went on for 2 pages. In 1996, Nathan Holt had purchased the abandoned Meridian Steelworks on the river using the entirety of his savings and a small inheritance from their father. He had believed the land could be remediated. He had believed he could clean the contamination from decades of industrial use and build something for the community on the recovered ground. Affordable housing, green space, a place that served the people who had been breathing the air from those stacks their whole lives. He had not been the only person interested in the land. Warren Cross had wanted it, not to clean it, to use it. Cross had a contract in place with a regional shipping consortium. River access, rail proximity, highway adjacency, 240 acres of industrial zoned land with no neighbors close enough to complain. The ideal site for a distribution and warehousing complex. The problem was the contamination. The real contamination, not the sanitized version. The actual readings from actual soil cores taken by actual scientists who had not been paid to reach a particular conclusion. Nathan had found the proof. He had documents showing that the environmental assessment Cross had submitted to the city's planning commission was fabricated, not adjusted, not optimistic, fabricated. The real numbers showed toxicity levels that would have made development illegal under both state and federal guidelines. Cross had paid 2 members of the city's Environmental Review Board to approve a false report. Nathan had the ledgers. He had the original falsified permits side by side with the real data. He had the names. He had been 3 days away from taking everything to the Post-Gazette when the gas line in his office building failed. The investigation lasted 9 days. The finding was accidental, a faulty valve in an aging building. No evidence of tampering. The case was closed. Jerry wrote that he had not believed it for a single day. Cross's people had come to him 11 days after the funeral. 2 men very polite in very good coats. They had spoken about the future of the city. They had spoken about how important it was in difficult times for families to stay safe. They had mentioned in passing that Nathan's daughter was very young and that it would be a terrible thing for a child to grow up without any family at all. The threat was quiet and it was absolute. Jerry had signed the papers that transferred what remained of Nathan's estate. He had taken the money Cross's lawyers placed in front of him. He had told them he knew nothing about any documents, any ledgers, any tapes. But he had kept one thing. He had taken everything Nathan had collected: the ledgers, the permits, the falsified assessments, the original deed to the Meridian land, and one other item he described only as a recording, and he had locked them in the ammunition case. He had sealed the case and placed it in a storage unit he paid for under a false name, along with the wooden box of his brother's personal effects and the letter he was now writing. He had paid the rent on Unit 447 for 9 years from a separate account. When he died, the payments would stop. Eventually, the unit would go delinquent. Eventually, it would be auctioned. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote it 5 times in 5 different ways, none of them adequate. He wrote that he had spent 15 years telling himself he was protecting Claire and her mother. He wrote that he knew in the honest part of himself that he rarely visited that he had been protecting himself. He wrote that he could not go to his grave without at least leaving the truth somewhere it might one day be found. I don't know who you are, the letter ended. Maybe you are a stranger who found this by accident. Maybe God is kinder than I deserve. If you have any courage, the courage I did not have, please find Nathan's daughter. Her name is Claire. She has been fighting that man her whole life without knowing what she's really fighting. Give her the truth. Give her the tools to finish what her father started. I am so sorry, Nathan. I am so sorry, Claire. I was a coward, and I have no excuse worth the ink it would take to write it. The letter was signed in the careful cursive of a man who had practiced his signature because it was the one thing that still felt controlled. Gerald Arthur Holt. Claire set the letter down on the desk. The office was very quiet. Outside, a bus went past on Butler Street. The fluorescent light above the desk hummed its thin, constant note. She was 8 years old the last time she saw her father. She remembered the smell of his jacket. She remembered the way he always had a pen tucked behind his ear that he would forget about, and then be surprised to find when he reached up to scratch his head. She remembered that he laughed loudly and without embarrassment, the laugh of a man who found things genuinely funny and saw no reason to moderate his response. She had been told in the particular careful language that adults use with children and around death that it had been an accident, a tragic and sudden accident. She had grown up with that. She had built her understanding of her own history on that. She had become the person she was partly in honor of a man who had died by misfortune, whose work had been unfinished by circumstance. For 30 years, she had been mourning the wrong death. Her father had not died by accident. Her father had been murdered. And the man who had done it, the man who had been quietly, methodically dismantling her organization for the past 6 months, was the same man. The same Warren Cross whose name was carved into the buildings of Pittsburgh. The same Warren Cross who had shaken her hand at a city council meeting 8 months ago and told her with genuine warmth and a firm grip that he admired her passion. She became aware that her hands flat on the desk on either side of the letter were completely still. She was not shaking. She had expected to shake. Instead, she felt something clarify inside her like a lens being adjusted until the image is suddenly perfectly sharp. She looked up at Ethan Cole. He was watching her with those quiet brown eyes. Not with pity, not with the awkward hypervigilance of someone waiting for a person to cry. Simply watching, present, the dog Rex lay at his feet with his head up, amber eyes moving between them. "The locked case," she said. Her voice was steady. "You said it has 3 combination locks." "Military grade," he said. "Late 80s, early 90s. I can't open it. I don't know anyone who can." "I might," she said. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked down at Butler Street for a moment, at the gray, ordinary Pittsburgh morning, carrying on its gray, ordinary business. Her father had dreamed about the Meridian land. He had put everything he had into it. He had died for it. And now, 30 years later, the same man who had killed him was trying to take it again and had been watching his daughter fight the battle her father started from close enough to smell the fear for months. The photograph was still in the wooden box on the desk. Nathan Holt grinning, his daughter on his shoulders, her small hands on his forehead, her eyes squeezed shut with joy. She crossed the room and picked up the photograph. She looked at it for a long time. She was not that little girl anymore. She had not been that little girl for a very long time. But she was still Nathan Holt's daughter. And Nathan Holt's daughter did not walk away from a fight, especially not the fight her father had died trying to finish. She placed the photograph carefully back in the wooden box and closed the lid. "There's a man named Frank Okafor," she said. "Oh, ex-FBI. He's been trying to build a case against Cross for 20 years. If anyone can open that box, he can." She looked at Ethan. "And there's something else. The letter mentions a recording." "A recording Nathan made." Ethan nodded once. "The case is still at the mill," he said. "I hid it." "Then we need to go get it," she said. Rex stood up from the floor as if he had been following the conversation and understood that the waiting was over. She picked up her coat. She looked at the letter on the desk, at her uncle's careful signature, at the years of silence, folded into those 2 pages. Jerry had been a coward, and he had known it, and he had lived with it until he couldn't anymore. She was not going to be her uncle. She was going to be her father. She turned off the office light and walked out. Frank Okafor lived in a narrow row house in Garfield with a porch light that stayed on all night and a front door that had 3 locks on it. Claire had met him twice before, both times at community forums, where he sat in the back row and said nothing until the meeting was nearly over, and then asked the one question that made everyone in the room go quiet. He was 62 years old, and he moved like a man who had spent decades learning to take up the minimum necessary space while seeing everything. She had his number from a mutual contact in the city's housing advocacy network. She called him from the car, while Ethan sat in the passenger seat with Rex in the back, the dog's chin resting on the center console between them. Frank answered on the second ring. She told him enough. Not everything. Enough. The silence on his end lasted 4 seconds. Then he said, "Come now. Don't stop anywhere first. Don't use your card for gas." He was standing on the porch when they pulled up. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Rex. He looked at Claire with the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for a particular door to open and is now watching it happen and is not entirely sure whether to feel relieved or afraid. "Come inside," he said. His living room had the organized density of a place where serious work had been done for a long time. One wall was given over almost entirely to a corkboard layered with papers, photographs, and index cards connected by lines of red string that had faded to pink. At the center of it, circled in black marker that had been gone over several times until the line was thick and certain, was a name. Warren Cross. Claire stood in front of the board for a long moment. "How long have you had this?" she said. "The board, about 12 years, Frank said. He moved to the kitchen and came back with 3 mugs of coffee without asking. The investigation itself longer. I started building a corruption case in 1999, spent 2 years on it, got close enough that certain people got uncomfortable. He handed a mug to Claire, one to Ethan. My supervisor called me in and told me the investigation was being suspended pending a national security review. Post-2001, that phrase meant whatever powerful people needed it to mean. They buried it, Claire said. They filed it in a room I don't have access to. He sat in the armchair across from the couch, holding his coffee in both hands. I resigned 8 months later. I wasn't going to spend a career stamping approved on other people's cover-ups. He looked at Claire steadily. Your father's name is on that board, Miss Holt. Has been since the beginning. I always believed the gas leak was engineered. I could never prove it. The proof exists, Claire said. She told him about the storage unit, about Jerry's letter, about the ammunition case, about the recording Nathan had made. Frank was very still while she spoke. When she finished, he set his coffee mug down on the table with exaggerated care, the way a man does when he needs to do something with his hands to keep his face composed. You're telling me Nathan Holt recorded Warren Cross threatening him directly? That's what my uncle's letter describes. Frank looked at the ceiling. He looked back at Claire. Where is the case now, he said. Hidden at the Meridian Mill, Ethan said. It was the first time he had spoken since they arrived. I can take you there. Frank nodded once. He stood up. Then we go tonight, he said, before Cross's people find it first. He said it so calmly, so practically, that it took Claire a moment to register the full meaning of the sentence. You think they're already looking, she said. Miss Holt? Frank said, pulling on his coat. The man has been systematically dismantling your organization for 6 months. Your donors didn't walk away on their own. Your windows didn't break themselves. He has been managing you the way he manages everything, slowly, methodically, from a distance, without fingerprints. He looked at her evenly. The only difference now is that something changed in his calculus. Something made him aware there might be a threat beyond your advocacy work. He paused. When did you start asking about the history of the Meridian land specifically? Not just the current project, the original ownership, the 1996 acquisition? Claire thought back. About 3 weeks ago, I submitted a public records request to the city, historical zoning records. Frank nodded, unsurprised. Public records requests are public, he said. He has people watching for that. He moved toward the door. We need to move. They took Frank's car, a plain gray sedan that smelled of old coffee and was unremarkable in the specific way of vehicles that were chosen to be unremarkable. Frank drove. Claire sat in front. Ethan and Rex were in the back. The city moved past the windows, street lights on wet asphalt. The bridges over the Allegheny lit in their orange glow against the dark water. Pittsburgh at night had a particular beauty that was inseparable from its history. All that iron and effort turned to light and reflection, the bones of an industrial century dressed up for a later age. Claire watched it and thought about her father driving these same streets 30 years ago, full of plans for a piece of contaminated land that he believed could be made clean. They turned off the main road onto a broken service lane that ran along the perimeter of the old mill. Frank cut the headlights 50 yards from the fence and rolled to a stop behind a collapsed section of brick wall. The Meridian steelworks rose against the night sky in a geometry of ruin. Skeletal frameworks of rusted steel. The dark rectangles of collapsed roof sections. The round bulk of the old furnace building rising above everything else like a structure that had decided to become a landmark despite itself. No lights anywhere, no movement, just the wind moving through the broken upper structures with a sound like breath. You lived here, Claire said quietly. She was looking at Ethan. The security office, he said, south side of the main building. Dry roof, intact window. He said it without inflection as a practical description of an adequate shelter. But Claire heard the other thing in it too, the particular efficiency of someone who had learned to measure adequacy against the alternative. They moved through the gap in the fence in single file, Rex slipping through last silent as smoke. Ethan led. He navigated the debris field of the main foundry floor without hesitation, without a flashlight, turning where the path required turning, stepping where the footing was solid. He knew this place in the dark the way a person knows a room they have crossed 1,000 times without light. They reached the small brick building at the south end of the complex. Ethan pushed the door open. The grinding of rusted metal against the concrete sill seemed very loud. Inside was the security office. Claire looked around it, a steel desk, a broken chair, a window filmed with grime but unbroken. The floor swept clear or as clear as the place allowed. A space that someone had worked to make functional in the way that people with very little make things functional, not through resources but through attention. In the corner, half concealed behind the desk, was the ammunition case. Flat black metal 12 inches by 8. Three combination locks in a line along the front edge. Frank crouched in front of it and ran his hands along the surface with the focused attention of a man reading something in a language he knows well. Military grade, he confirmed. Mosler tumbler locks, late 80s design. He looked up. I can open them. It'll take time. How much time? Claire said. Enough time for you to tell me what else is in this building that we need to worry about, he said. He was already pulling a leather roll of tools from his coat pocket. Ethan shook his head. We swept the perimeter coming in. No vehicles on the service road. No lights in the upper floors. We're clear. Frank unrolled the leather case on the floor beside him, picked up a thin tool and a small stethoscope, put the earpieces in, pressed the bell of the stethoscope against the body of the first lock, and began to turn the dial with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who has done this before and knows that rushing is the only way to fail. The room was very quiet. Rex moved to the doorway and lay down facing out his ears in constant rotation, a living instrument calibrated to the frequency of approaching danger. Claire sat on the floor with her back against the wall, knees up the wooden box in her lap. She opened it and looked at the photographs inside by the thin light of Frank's work lamp. Nathan at different ages. Nathan and a woman who must have been Claire's mother, young and laughing in a park somewhere. Nathan crouched down to the level of a very small girl pointing at something off camera, the girl looking in the direction he was pointing with absolute trust. Ethan sat a few feet away from her in the same position, back against the wall, knees up. He was watching the door over Rex's head. He had the particular alert stillness of a man whose vigilance had become involuntary, a system that ran in the background whether he chose it to or not. You were a mechanic, she said quietly, not to start a conversation. Just because the silence had weight in it and she needed to put something small into it. Recovery vehicles, he said, retrieval and repair in the field. When something broke down somewhere, it wasn't supposed to break down, we went and got it. And something broke down wrong, she said. She had read between the lines of enough things to know the shape of the story without its details. A man named Marcus Webb, he said. His voice was level and factual. Hydraulic failure on a recovery lift. Substandard parts on a government contract. The investigation ruled it operator error. The man who ruled it that way, a colonel named Richard Voss, had a reason to protect the supplier. He paused. I knew what happened. I knew why it happened. I had documentation. I signed a report that said otherwise. They pressured you, Claire said. Yes, he said, and I let them. He said it without self-pity, which made it worse, somehow cleaner and harder. I told myself there were reasons, that fighting it would accomplish nothing, that Marcus was already dead and the truth wouldn't change that. He was quiet for a moment. I've had a lot of time to understand the difference between reasons and excuses. The first lock clicked. Frank murmured something that was not quite a word and moved to the second. My uncle said the same thing in different words, Claire said, that Nathan was already dead, that the truth wouldn't change it. She looked at the photograph in her hand. What it changes is what comes after. Ethan looked at her. In the dim light, his face was all shadow and plain, the weathering in it standing out clearly, but the eyes still that same quiet brown. Yes, he said, that's exactly what it changes. The second lock clicked. Then Rex made a sound. It was not a bark, not a growl, a single high, tight note almost below the range of hearing that Claire felt more in her chest than heard with her ears. Then the fur along the back of his neck rose in a single slow wave, and he came to his feet without urgency, but with total commitment, facing the door. Ethan was moving before Claire had fully processed the sound. He was at the wall beside the door frame and 2 steps back flat against the brick, looking at Frank without needing to say anything. Frank set down his tools without a sound. His hand moved inside his coat. They waited. The footsteps came from the north side of the building, 2 sets unhurried, the confident walk of people who expected to be the most dangerous thing in the space they were entering. The crunch of boot soles on frozen debris. A brief exchange of low words too quiet to make out, and then the sweep of a flashlight beam cutting past the doorframe of the security office. Claire pressed herself against the wall. Her heart was very loud. The beam moved away. They were checking the main foundry floor first. Back door, Ethan breathed. Just those two words barely moving his lips. Frank was already closing the ammunition case, lifting it from the floor. He moved without sound in a way that suggested his FBI training had been thorough on the question of weight distribution and footfall. Ethan touched Claire's arm once, a direction, not a comfort, and moved toward the rear of the small room, where a second door she hadn't noticed it in the dark was set into the back wall. A maintenance exit. He had known it was there. Of course he had known it was there. He eased it open, an inch at a time. Cold air, dark alley between the security building and the outer fence. Clear. They moved through it in order. Frank, with the case, Claire, Rex, Ethan last. Ethan pulled the door shut behind them without sound. The alley was black. No moon. The outer fence ran along the right side of it, the security building's brick wall along the left. 30 yards to the gap in the fence. Claire could see it as a slightly lighter rectangle against the darkness, the bent chain link framing a section of the service road beyond. They were 15 yards from the gap when the flashlight beam swept around the corner of the building behind them. There. A man's voice. Sharp. Running. Not a choice, just what the body does when the calculation completes itself instantly. Claire ran. The gravel under her boots announced every step, and she couldn't do anything about that. Frank was ahead of her, the case under one arm, moving with a speed that did not match the impression he gave standing still. Rex was a gray blur at her side. The gap in the fence, Frank threw first, the case scraping the chain link with a metallic shriek. Claire threw, catching her coat on the bent wire, pulling hard, feeling it tear. Rex threw in a single fluid motion. Ethan threw last, spinning on the other side to face back through the gap. The man coming up the alley was large and fast. He had the size of someone who had been chosen for this kind of work partly because of what he looked like. He was maybe 20 yards away and closing. Ethan looked at Rex. He pointed not at the man but at the right down the service road that ran parallel to the fence, the opposite direction from Frank's car. Rex, he said, just the name, and then a single word, go. Rex understood. He ran not away, not toward the man. He ran parallel along the fence and then rounded the corner of the brick wall and exploded into sound. A volley of barks that hit the old brick in the iron structures like cannon fire, the acoustics of the dead mill amplifying everything until it came from everywhere at once, disorienting and enormous. The dog, it went that way. A second voice from somewhere around the south side of the building. The large man slowed, stopped, looked at the gap in the fence where Claire and Ethan were pressed against the outer wall in the shadow, invisible and not breathing. He turned toward the sound of the barking and ran. Ethan exhaled. Now, he said. They moved fast and low along the wall, away from the fence gap, away from the sound of the barking that was already beginning to fade as Rex circled away from the pursuit. Frank's car was 40 yards ahead. The doors unlocked with a quiet click as Frank hit the fob. They were in and moving before the doors were fully closed. Frank drove without lights until they were 3 blocks from the mill. Then the headlights came on and he turned north and kept his speed precisely at the limit, the way you drive when you need to be invisible and know that the way to be invisible on a public road is to do nothing that would cause someone to look at you. Claire sat in the front seat and breathed. Her coat was torn at the shoulder. Her hands were shaking now, finally, in the delayed way that adrenaline leaves the body once the immediate need for it is over. She pressed them flat against her thighs and made them stop. Rex reappeared at a corner 6 blocks from the mill, sitting calmly under a streetlight as though waiting for a bus. Ethan spotted him first. Frank pulled over without being asked. Rex jumped into the back seat, turned once, and lay down with his head on Ethan's knee, breathing hard but satisfied. Good boy, Ethan said quietly. They drove to Margaret Weston's office. Frank had already called her from the road with 3 words, "We have it." Margaret Weston was 52 years old and had spent 25 years as an independent attorney in Pittsburgh, which meant she had spent 25 years being the person that other people called when the situation had moved past the point where normal options applied. She was a tall woman with close-cropped gray hair and an office that was meticulous in the way of someone who understood that disorder in a professional environment was a form of vulnerability. She met them at the side entrance of her building on Liberty Avenue and said nothing until they were upstairs with the door locked. Then she looked at the ammunition case on her conference table and said, "Open it, Frank." Frank sat down with his tools and the stethoscope and resumed where he had left off. The third lock was the most resistant. He worked at it for 11 minutes. The room was very quiet. Margaret made coffee with the particular focused efficiency of someone who had learned to do useful things during waiting rather than simply endure the wait. She placed a mug in front of each of them, including one in front of the empty chair closest to Rex, which she then moved 6 inches closer to the dog in a gesture that was both precise and oddly tender. Claire sat with her hands wrapped around her mug and watched Frank work and thought about her father, who had filled this case with the tools of his own undoing, the proof that would get him killed, and locked it, and trusted that the locks in the hiding place would hold long enough for someone to find them and have the courage to do something with what they found. He had been optimistic about that. He had died optimistic. The third lock released with a sound like a quiet exhalation. Frank looked up at Claire. "It's yours," he said. She stood up. She walked to the table. She looked at the case for a moment at the 3 locks hanging open at the flat black surface worn smooth at the corners from handling. She lifted the lid. The smell that rose from it was old paper and dry leather and the particular still quality of sealed air of atmosphere preserved from another time. It was the smell of 1996 somehow, the smell of evidence that had been waiting. Frank and Margaret began lifting the contents out one item at a time, laying each piece on the conference table with the careful deliberateness of people who understood they were handling the kind of material that gets handled once and never touched carelessly again. A leather-bound journal, Nathan's handwriting on the inside cover, his name, and a date. Claire opened it. The pages were dense with notes, dates, figures, observations. The meticulous record of a man building a case with the same care a lawyer or a journalist would bring to it, because he had understood from the beginning that care was the only protection available to him. A folder of documents, environmental permits dated 1995 and 1996, signed, stamped official in every visible respect, and beneath them another folder, the real assessments. The actual soil core analyses, the actual toxicity readings, the actual numbers from the actual ground. The difference between the two sets of documents was not ambiguous. It was the difference between a clean bill of health and a contamination map that should have stopped every conversation about development for a generation. 2 accounting ledgers, columns of figures in a practiced hand with dates and notations that would mean nothing to a casual reader and everything to a forensic accountant or a federal prosecutor. Payments flowing out of a shell company with a name that appeared on no public filing flowing into accounts associated with 2 names that appeared on the city's Environmental Review Board. And then at the bottom of the case, something small, easily missed. A black Olympus Pearl quarter, a microcassette recorder, no larger than a pack of cards with a single cassette inside it. A piece of adhesive tape across the cassette door, holding it shut. Written on the tape in Nathan Holt's handwriting, in letters small enough to require leaning close to read WC, November 12, 1996. 3 days before Nathan Holt died. Margaret placed the recorder on the table in the center of everything. The 5 of them, Frank, Margaret, Claire, Ethan, and Rex, looked at it. "We'll need a forensic audio specialist to restore it properly," Frank said. 30 years the tape may have degraded. "How long will that take?" Claire said. "I know someone who can turn it around in 24 hours if I ask the right way." He looked at her steadily. "But Claire, even without the tape, what's on this table right now, the ledgers, the permits, the journal, this is a federal corruption case. This isn't a zoning dispute anymore. This isn't a community coalition versus a developer. This is bribery of public officials. This is falsification of government documents. This is potentially evidence in a 30-year-old homicide." The word homicide sat in the room. Margaret said quietly, "There's more." They all looked at her. She had been on her laptop while Frank worked. She had the look of someone who had not slept and was running on professional necessity and the particular cold clarity that comes when something you suspected is confirmed in larger terms than you expected. She had used the names from Nathan's journal, the 2 men on the review board, the shell company, the dates as starting points. She had spent the night tracing threads through public records, old court filings, archived news, and the databases she paid access to specifically for situations like this. She turned the laptop to face the table. Nathan Holt was not the only person who became inconvenient to Warren Cross in that period, she said. Between 1996 and 1998, 6 other men died in what were officially ruled accidents on or adjacent to Cross development sites. A site foreman, 2 independent inspectors, a city planner, a local reporter who had been working on a story about river contamination, and a retired engineer who had submitted a dissenting review to the Planning Commission. The silence in the room was complete. 7 men, Claire said. 7 men, Margaret confirmed. I've been in contact tonight with a woman named Patricia Odom. She is the daughter of the site foreman. She has been trying for 20 years to get someone to take her seriously about the circumstances of her father's death. Margaret looked at Claire. She is not alone. I have preliminary contact with representatives of 3 of the other families. They are all to a person waiting for someone to tell them they are not crazy, that what they always believed is true. Claire looked at the table, at the journal and the ledgers and the permits and the small recorder with the tape inside it, at everything her father had died collecting, at everything her uncle had been too afraid to use. She thought about Warren Cross shaking her hand at the city council meeting, the warmth of his grip, the sincerity in his voice when he said he admired her passion. She thought about Jerry living with this for 15 years before he could bring himself to even write a letter and hide it in a box. She thought about Ethan, who had signed a false report for a dead friend and spent years in the ruins of that decision. She looked at Frank, who had built a case once and watched it get buried and had kept the board on his wall for 12 years because some part of him had never accepted the burial as final. There were different kinds of courage, the loud kind that announces itself and the quiet kind that simply refuses to stop. We need to meet with Cross, Claire said. Margaret nodded as though she had been waiting for Claire to arrive at this. On our terms, Margaret said. In this office, I want him here, not his lawyer's offices, not on his ground. She paused. And Claire, I want him in the room, not his representatives. Cross himself. He'll never agree to that, Claire said. He'll agree, Frank said, when he finds out what we have. He'll want to see how much we actually know. He'll want to assess the threat directly. He looked at her with his careful, steady eyes. That's the thing about men like Cross. They've been in control so long that facing a problem directly still feels like the safest option. He won't be able to resist. Rex had moved while they were talking. He was sitting beside Claire now, close enough that his shoulder was against her leg. She had not noticed him move. She put her hand on his head without looking down, and he leaned into it, warm and solid and present. Outside the windows of Margaret Weston's office, Pittsburgh was beginning the slow business of moving from night toward dawn. The sky over the river was still dark, but somewhere to the east behind the hills, there was the first barely perceptible suggestion of a change. Claire looked at the recorder, at the tape inside it, at her father's handwriting on the strip of adhesive that had held it sealed for almost 30 years. W.C., November 12, 1996, 3 days before they killed him. He had known something was coming. He had known, and he had recorded it anyway. He had done the dangerous, careful, meticulous work of a man who understood that he might not be there to tell the story himself and who had prepared for that possibility with the same committed clarity he had brought to everything. She was going to finish what he started. Not for justice as an abstraction, not for the memory of a man she had lost at 8 years old, for the 7 families sitting in their houses in Pittsburgh right now who deserved to know that the people they had lost had not died carelessly, that they had died because they had been in someone's way, that the someone had a name, and that the name was about to stop being a plaque on a wall and start being the answer to a question that had waited 30 years to be asked. She looked up at Frank. Make the call to your audio contact, she said, and then I want to know everything you know about how Warren Cross operates when he's cornered. The forensic audio specialist Frank knew was a woman named Irene Tasker, who worked out of a converted warehouse in Bloomfield and had spent 30 years restoring damaged recordings for law enforcement agencies, documentary filmmakers, and on one occasion a federal grand jury that had needed a 40-year-old wire recording made audible enough to convict a man who had believed time had protected him. Frank dropped the recorder with her at 6 in the morning. She called back at 11 the following day. It's there, she told Frank. The tape degraded along the edges, but the center track is intact. I've cleaned it up. You can hear every word. She sent the file encrypted to Frank's laptop. He played it once a month in his car in the parking garage beneath Margaret Weston's building. Then he came upstairs and told Claire and Margaret what was on it. Warren Cross's voice, younger by 30 years, but unmistakable in its particular quality of calm authority, the voice of a man who had never had to raise it to make himself understood. And Nathan Holt's voice, steady and careful, the voice of a man who knew the recorder in his pocket was the only protection he had and was determined to keep the conversation moving toward the territory he needed it to reach. The recording lasted 11 minutes and 40 seconds. In those 11 minutes and 40 seconds, Warren Cross told Nathan Holt with the unhurried precision of someone describing a business arrangement rather than a threat that the Meridian Project would proceed. That the documentation Nathan believed he possessed would be proven inadequate, misinterpreted, or simply unavailable when the time came. That the city's review process had already reached its conclusions. And that Nathan's continued public opposition to the project represented a problem that Cross was prepared to solve in whatever manner proved most efficient. He did not say the word kill. Men like Warren Cross had not survived 40 years by saying words like that in rooms where they might be recorded. But the meaning was precise and complete and required no translation. Nathan had said near the end of the recording, his voice still level, "I want to make sure I understand you correctly, Mr. Cross." And Cross had said, with a patience that was its own form of menace, "I believe you understand me perfectly, Mr. Holt." 3 days later, Nathan Holt was dead. Margaret listened to the recording in her office with her eyes closed and her hands flat on the desk. When it ended, she sat without moving for a long moment. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Claire. "That's enough," she said simply. "That's more than enough." The meeting was arranged for the following morning. Margaret's office on Liberty Avenue occupied the third floor of a building that had been a bank in a previous life, and the conference room retained the proportions and gravity of that earlier purpose. High ceilings, tall windows looking out over the street, a mahogany table long enough to seat 12. The room had the quality of a place where serious things had been decided and the weight of those decisions had accumulated in the walls over time. Claire arrived first. She sat at the center of one side of the table and placed the wooden box in front of her. Not as a prop, just because she wanted her father in the room. Frank arrived next. He sat to her left and said nothing. He had the settled quality of a man who had waited 20 years for a particular morning and had now arrived at it and found it exactly as serious as he had always believed it would be. Margaret came in from the inner office, placed a single folder on the table in front of her chair, and stood by the window looking down at the street. Ethan sat at the far end of the table near the door with Rex beside his chair. He was there as a witness and as a presence, and he understood both roles without being told. Dex Calloway, the investigative reporter from the Post-Gazette, sat against the far wall with a legal pad on his knee. He had the wiry, impatient energy of a man who had spent his career pursuing stories that powerful people wanted buried and had developed a profound and productive anger about the size of the gap between what happened and what got reported. Frank had brought him in the previous evening. He had listened to the recording twice and spent the rest of the night making calls that confirmed 3 additional details from Nathan's journal that they had not yet been able to independently verify. He was there to observe and to understand that what he was about to witness was a story he would be given the opportunity to tell, but that the telling would happen on Claire's timeline, not his. At 10 minutes past 10, the elevator doors opened in the outer office and they heard voices. Warren Cross entered the conference room ahead of his lawyer, which told Claire something about him immediately, that he was a man who led from the front, not out of bravery, but out of the habit of dominance. The reflex of someone who had spent so long being the most powerful presence in every room he entered that he no longer questioned whether that was still the case. He was 72 years old and he was impressively put together. A dark charcoal suit cut close, white hair that had the authority of age without the diminishment of it, a face that had settled into the kind of distinguished weathering that looks on men of a certain class like gravitas rather than erosion. His eyes were pale and alert and moved around the room with the speed of a man conducting a rapid threat assessment, which was Claire realized exactly what he was doing. His lawyer, a compact man named Hargrove, who carried his briefcase with the aggressive posture of someone whose job it was to manage situations before they became crises, took the chair to Cross's right. Tyler Cross sat down last. He was 35 and looked like the business school version of his grandfather, the same strong jaw and pale eyes. But on him, they sat in a face still undecided about what it was becoming. He wore his suit with slightly less certainty than the older man, the tell of someone who had inherited status rather than built it and occasionally felt the gap. Cross looked at Claire. He looked at Frank and registered recognition. He looked at Ethan at the end of the table with a slight narrowing of the eyes, the variable, the unfamiliar element, the thing that his preparation had not fully accounted for. "Miss Holt," he said. His voice was the same voice from the recording, 30 years of age in it now, but the fundamental quality unchanged, warm on the surface, with something underneath that had the temperature of deep water. "I appreciate you making the time." "Thank you for coming, Mr. Cross," Claire said. She kept her voice even. She had practiced this particular evenness for 2 days, and it felt solid now, like ground she could stand on. "I'll be direct since I think that's what serves everyone here." He settled back slightly in his chair, the posture of a man humoring a process he expected to control. "We have recovered materials belonging to my father, Nathan Holt," Claire said. "These materials were secured in 1996 and have remained undiscovered until recently. They include the original environmental assessments for the Meridian land, the real assessments, not the versions submitted to the Planning Commission. They include accounting records documenting payments made to 2 members of the city's Environmental Review Board. They include my father's personal journal, which details the full scope of what he found and who he found it pointing toward." Hargrove, the lawyer, was already drawing breath to speak. Cross put a hand on the table and Hargrove stopped. "And," Claire said, "they include an audio recording made by my father on November 12, 1996, 3 days before he died." She watched Cross's face. His expression did not change. That was the thing about men who had spent 40 years managing information and consequences. They had learned to keep their faces still when information arrived that required immediate internal recalculation. But his eyes moved, just slightly, just once, to the wooden box on the table in front of Claire and then back to her face. "That's a significant claim," Hargrove said. His voice had the professionally skeptical quality of someone who has been paid to doubt things. "Documents from 30 years ago, absent any chain of custody, absent any authenticated provenance." "Frank," Claire said. Frank Okafor placed a single sheet of paper on the table and slid it down toward the lawyer. "Forensic authentication report," Frank said. "The recording was analyzed yesterday by Irene Tasker, 20-year career in evidence authentication for federal and state law enforcement. Her findings are in that document." He let that sit for a moment. "The recording is authentic. The voice analysis is consistent with known recordings of Mr. Cross from the same period. There is no ambiguity in her conclusions." Hargrove looked at the document. He kept his face professionally composed, but something in his posture shifted the way a structure shifts when one of its foundational assumptions is removed. "Mr. Cross," Margaret said from her end of the table, "I've also been retained by Patricia Odom, daughter of Gerald Odom, site foreman, who died in 1997 on the Westfield Bridge project, and by the families of 2 additional men who died in circumstances connected to your development projects in the same period." She opened her folder. "We have identified 7 deaths total, including Nathan Holt, across a 26-month window. I have retained independent forensic consultants who have reviewed the original accident reports. Their findings regarding certain inconsistencies in those reports are also in front of you." She placed a second document on the table. The room was very quiet. Cross looked at the documents. He looked at them with the careful attention of a man reading a map and discovering that the terrain it describes is not the terrain he believed he was standing in. Then he looked at Claire. "Miss Holt," he said. His voice was still level, still warm, still somehow the voice of a man who believed he was managing the situation. "I understand this is deeply personal for you. The loss of a parent at a young age, I have my own experience of that kind of grief, and I know that it can shape how we interpret events, how we look for explanations that feel adequate to the scale of the loss." He paused. "What you have described is a serious set of allegations. My team will need to review everything you've presented. We should allow the appropriate processes to—" "Mr. Cross," Claire said. He stopped. She reached into the folder beside the wooden box and took out a small device, a digital recorder, Irene Tasker's restored file transferred to a current format. She placed it on the center of the table. "I want to make sure I understand you correctly," she said. She pressed play. The voice that came out of the small speaker was Warren Cross's voice from 1996, young and cold and precise. Every word of the 11 minutes and 40 seconds filling the conference room with the sound of a conversation that had been intended to leave no record and had instead been waiting 30 years for this room, this morning, this audience. Cross's voice saying Nathan Holt's name. Cross's voice describing with the patience of absolute certainty how the situation would resolve. And near the end, Nathan's voice steady and deliberate. I want to make sure I understand you correctly, Mr. Cross. And Cross's voice final and unhurried. I believe you understand me perfectly, Mr. Holt. Claire stopped the recording. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Warren Cross sat very still. His face had undergone a change that was not dramatic, but was complete. The warmth was gone. The managed authority was gone. What remained was a face stripped to its structure, and the structure was old and tired, and for the first time in the hours since he had entered the room, genuinely uncertain. He had spent 40 years being the man who knew things that other people didn't know. He had spent 40 years being the person who held the recording, metaphorically speaking, the information, the leverage, the capability that others lacked. He was sitting now in the experience of its opposite, and he did not have a vocabulary for it because he had never needed one. His lawyer was writing rapidly on a legal pad, the pen moving with the mechanical urgency of someone trying to find footing on a surface that had stopped being solid. Tyler Cross had not moved since the recording ended. He sat had his hands on the table in front of him, looking at neither Claire nor his grandfather, but at some middle distance between them, where the arithmetic of the situation was apparently visible to him in a way that required his full attention. He was the one who spoke first. Grandfather, he said, his voice was quiet, not gentle quiet in the way of someone choosing words for their precision rather than their comfort. I need you to hear me. Cross turned to look at his grandson. The tape is authenticated, Tyler said. The forensic report is from a credible source with a federal track record. We have 3 independent families represented in a joint civil action with documentation of irregularities and accident investigations spanning 26 months. He paused. Dex Calloway is sitting against that wall, which means the Post-Gazette already has the story. The only question on the table right now is what version of it runs tomorrow morning. Tyler, the lawyer began. I'm not finished, Tyler said in the same quiet voice. He looked at his grandfather steadily. If this goes to trial, federal corruption, bribery of public officials, and whatever a prosecutor decides to do with a recording of a conversation, 3 days before a man died in what is now a contested accident, the stock is gone before the first motion is filed. Every institutional relationship we have is gone. The hospital wing, the university building, all of it becomes a liability that those institutions will move to distance themselves from before the ink on the complaint is dry. He paused. I am going to be running this company for the next 40 years. I cannot run it from this. He turned to look at Claire. What are your terms? Hargrove said sharply. Tyler, this is not the appropriate. What are your terms? Tyler said again, not to the lawyer, to Claire. Claire looked at Tyler Cross for a moment. She recognized something in him that she did not particularly like and did not particularly need to like a man making a moral calculation that arrived at the right answer for entirely practical reasons. The answer was still the right answer. She looked at Margaret. Margaret opened her folder. A full public acknowledgement, Margaret said, from Warren Cross personally, not from corporate counsel, of his role in the falsification of environmental documentation submitted to the city in 1995 and 1996. An acknowledgement of the payments made to city officials, and an acknowledgement that the circumstances of Nathan Holt's death and the deaths of the other 6 individuals identified in our documentation were not accidents. Hargrove was shaking his head continuously, a machine set to one motion. A compensation fund, Margaret continued, of $20 million administered independently for the families of the 7 deceased. Structured to be established within 90 days. And a $30 million endowment, Claire said. Her voice was steady. She had not planned to speak here, had planned to let Margaret carry the terms to their conclusion. But this part she needed to say herself. To establish a permanent fund for workplace safety advocacy in Pittsburgh, named for the 7 men, not for a building, not for a wing, for the work they were trying to do when they were killed. The room was quiet. Tyler looked at his grandfather. Warren Cross sat at the table with his hands folded in front of him. He was looking at Claire. The pale eyes that had assessed her when he walked in the rapid threat calculation of a man who had expected to be the most powerful presence in the room were different now. They were not broken or diminished in the way of a man defeated. They were simply empty of the particular certainty that had animated them for 40 years, the certainty that his version of events was the version that would survive. He knew what the recording was. He had known the moment she said the date. He had spent 30 years being certain that no recording existed. He had been wrong. And the specific quality of being catastrophically wrong about the one thing you are most certain of leaves a mark on a face that cannot be composed away. He looked at Claire and she held his gaze and she did not look away. She thought about her father, about a man in his early 30s with unruly hair and a pen behind his ear, who had believed with the unreasonable conviction of the genuinely idealistic that the truth, if gathered carefully enough and documented precisely enough, would be sufficient protection. He had been wrong about that. The truth had not been sufficient protection. But he had been right about something more fundamental, that the truth once gathered and documented does not expire. It waits. 30 years in a lockbox in a rented storage unit, and it waits. "Draft the agreement," Warren Cross said. His voice was flat, not defeated, not remorseful flat. The voice of a man signing a document because the calculation has resolved and the document is the only remaining move. His hands, when he picked up the pen that Hargrove placed in front of him, were steady. He had not become a different person. He had simply run out of room. He signed. Tyler Cross signed beneath him his name, clean and businesslike, the signature of someone who had already turned to face the direction he was going to spend the rest of his career managing. They left without ceremony, no handshakes, no parting words. The elevator doors closed and the room was still. Dex Calloway looked up from his legal pad. His expression was that of a man who has just watched something he had spent his career believing was possible actually happen, and who is still in the process of accepting that it was real. When he asked, "Tomorrow," Claire said, "front page." He nodded, gathered his things, and left. Margaret began collecting the documents from the table with the methodical care of someone processing a large amount of irreplaceable material. Frank sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has just set it down and is trying to remember how his body feels without it. Ethan sat at the end of the table. Rex lay at his feet. They were both very still. Claire looked at the wooden box in front of her. She opened the lid. The photograph was there, where it always was now. Nathan Holt with his daughter on his shoulders, both of them caught in a moment of uncomplicated joy that neither of them had known at the time was 30 seconds in the future from a camera flash, and 30 years from the morning his daughter would finally know the truth of who he had been. She closed the box. The story that ran the next morning was as Dex Calloway had promised, front page. The Meridian Truth Cross admits 30-year cover-up, 7 deaths linked to fraud. The headline was clean and direct, the way serious stories are when the facts are sufficient and require no embellishment. The article was 4,000 words, documented with forensic precision, and it named names and dates and amounts with the steady confidence of a writer who knew that every claim was supported 6 ways. By noon, Cross Corporation's stock had fallen 31%. By 2 in the afternoon, UPMC had issued a statement indicating they were reviewing the naming arrangement on the pediatric wing. Carnegie Mellon followed at 4. The name above the engineering building entrance would be evaluated, they said, in light of the new information. The city council convened an emergency session. The mayor's office issued a statement indicating that the Meridian Riverfront project permit application was suspended pending a comprehensive review. 3 current council members retained personal legal counsel before the day was out. The 2 former members of the Environmental Review Board, both now in their 70s, were identified in Dex's follow-up piece 48 hours later. One released a statement through his attorney, the other did not respond to contact. Warren Cross did not make a public statement. His lawyer released the agreed acknowledgement on his behalf, 3 paragraphs of precise legal language that said what it said without a single word of genuine contrition. Tyler Cross appeared on the local news the following week in the controlled setting of a prepared statement speaking about the corporation's commitment to accountability and reform in a language so polished it had clearly been written by someone else. But the words he had spoken in Margaret Weston's conference room, The quiet and sentimental calculation of a young man deciding that truth was more survivable than the alternative. Those words had not been written by anyone. Those had been his. The compensation fund was established in 63 days. 90 had been the deadline. Patricia Odom, whose father had died on the Westfield Bridge project in 1997, came to Margaret's office to sign the final paperwork on a Tuesday afternoon. She was 58 years old, and she cried quietly and without embarrassment, holding the pen with both hands. She said that her mother had never believed it was an accident and had never stopped saying so. She said she wished her mother had lived to see this. Claire held Patricia Odom's hands for a long moment in the lobby of the building, and neither of them said anything because there was nothing that needed to be said that the silence didn't already contain. 6 months after the morning in the conference room, the Meridian Steelworks was a construction site. The old furnace building had been stabilized, and its bones were being incorporated into the design of the new structure, a choice the architect had made deliberately preserving the industrial history of the land rather than erasing it the way the truth of a place persists even when you build something new on top of it. The main foundry floor was coming down carefully, section by section, the rusted steel sorted for recycling. Where the collapsed loading dock had been, the foundation for the community center was already poured. Claire stood at the site most mornings, not supervising the construction manager handled that, but present, watching. The way you watch something being built when you understand what it costs and what it means. The community center would have affordable housing on the upper floors and community services on the ground level. A health clinic, a job training center, a dedicated suite of offices for veterans support services staffed by people who had been through the same systems that had failed men like Ethan Cole and who understood the specific ways that those failures accumulated. Ethan Cole was the site facilities manager. It was Margaret who had first used the phrase in the context of the job description, but Claire who had offered him the position, standing on the construction site on a cold morning in March, with blueprints spread on the hood of a truck between them. He had looked at the blueprints for a long moment. Then he had looked at her. "I don't have credentials," he said. "No certification, no degree. I have an honorable discharge and a knowledge of machinery. You have 20 years of experience with recovery and repair in conditions where failure wasn't an option," she said. "You navigated this entire site in the dark from memory under pressure without losing anyone. You built a fire out of a barrel and some scrap wood that kept 2 people alive on the coldest night of the year." She looked at him evenly. "I'm not looking for a credential. I'm looking for someone who knows how to keep things running and who I can trust." He looked at the blueprints again, at the site around them, at the frozen ground that had been industrial wasteland for 30 years and was now slowly and irreversibly being turned into something that served people. "Yes," he said, "I'll take it." He had an apartment now on the second floor of the renovated administrative building, one of the first units completed, small and clean and warm, with a refrigerator that was never empty and a bed that was never cold. Rex had a corner by the window that he had claimed on the first day and defended with the gravity of a dog who understood property rights. On the afternoon that the last structural section of the old foundry came down and the full scope of the new building's footprint became visible for the first time, Claire and Ethan stood together at the edge of the site and watched. Rex sat between them, his thick gray and white coat catching the late afternoon light, his amber eyes scanning the site with the calm, comprehensive attention that was simply his nature, neither on duty nor off. It's simply present as he had always been. The Allegheny River caught the sun to the west. The city rose behind them, all its layered history, and its complicated present, its names carved into buildings that were being reconsidered, its truth emerging slowly from the places where it had been stored against the day when someone would find the courage to bring it out into the light. Claire looked at the footprint of the building that was coming, at the space where the Veterans Support Suite would be, and the health clinic, and the affordable units for families who had been told for decades that this land was not for them. Her father had stood somewhere on this ground 30 years ago and seen it the same way, not as what it was, but as what it could become, the way idealists see the world stubbornly and at great cost without ever quite being wrong. She thought about the small recorder on the conference table, about the voice on the tape and the voice that had answered it, about 11 minutes and 40 seconds that had waited in the dark for 30 years and had finally irreversibly been heard. She put her hand on Rex's head. The dog leaned into it, warm and solid, the weight of a living thing that had found what it was looking for and had no need to look for anything else. The light over Pittsburgh was turning gold. She let it hold her for a moment, the late light and the sound of construction, and the particular quality of standing on ground that had been fought for and won on a day when the long work of honoring someone you loved had arrived at a place where it could finally rest. Then she picked up her blueprints from the makeshift table behind her, tucked them under her arm, and went back to work.